You are conscious right now. You know you are, you can feel it, but you cannot prove it to anyone else. For most of human history, that impossibility was considered reason enough to stop asking. One man decided it was reason enough to begin. He was a neuroscientist. He had a formula. This is a story from a time before we knew. There is a patient lying in a hospital somewhere right now. Their eyes are open. The monitors say they are alive. Their eyes follow the light when the doctor moves it, but they do not speak, they do not respond. And the doctor standing there faces a question medicine cannot answer. Is anyone home? That question, whether there is experience inside a body that cannot tell you, has no definitive answer. Not today, not yet. This is the story of the question and of the man who decided to measure it. In the 1990s, one of the most celebrated scientists of the 20th century spent the last years of his career asking a question his peers found embarrassing. He had co-discovered the structure of DNA. He had reshaped biology. And now he wanted to know what made a brain conscious, not metaphorically, physically, mechanically. Where in the brain did experience live? His colleagues were polite, most of them. The 20th century had made a decision about consciousness. In the 1950s, the dominant school of psychology, behaviorism, had declared that inner experience was not a scientific subject. Only what could be observed and measured from the outside counted. Asking what it felt like to be a human being and from the inside was considered a category error, soft, unscientific. Philosophy had that conversation, science did not. For most of the 20th century, there was effectively a gentleman's agreement in science. We do not ask about consciousness. We study the brain, we measure behavior, we leave experience to the philosophers. The brain was mapped, its regions catalogued, its electrical activity recorded. Researchers understood what the brain did, almost nothing about what it was like to have one. Crick believed the question was not merely philosophical, it was biological, and it was urgent. He kept working on it until the last weeks of his life. Across the country, in a neuroscience department, a young researcher was arriving at the same conviction, by a different route. His background was in sleep and consciousness research. He had spent years studying what happened to the brain during unconscious states, anesthesia, deep sleep, and he had noticed something specific. When the brain was conscious, its activity was integrated. Different regions talking to each other, sharing information across the whole. When it was unconscious, that integration collapsed. The regions fell silent to each other. The difference was not in how active the brain was, it was in how connected the activity was. Consciousness, he began to think, was not a thing, it was a relationship between parts. And if that was true, if consciousness was about integration, then in principle any sufficiently integrated system might have some form of experience. Any system, not just humans, not just animals. He stayed with that thought for a long time. In 1994, a young Australian philosopher stood up at a conference in Tucson, Arizona, and said something the audience was not expecting. He said there are two problems of consciousness, the easy problems, explaining how the brain processes information, controls behavior, integrates signals. Science will eventually solve those, but there is another problem. He called it the hard problem. The hard problem is this. Why does any physical process in the brain produce subjective experience at all? Why is there something it is like to see red, to feel pain, to hear a note of music? The brain activity can be measured. The experience cannot. You can record every neuron that fires when a person sees blue. You cannot record what it is like for them to see it. The audience argued with him. Some dismissed him, a philosopher, not a neuroscientist. What did he know about the brain? But the phrase stuck. The hard problem. It spread through philosophy and neuroscience like a slow fire. It gave a name to what everyone had been avoiding, and it made the question impossible to dismiss. You can explain the mechanism. You cannot explain why the mechanism produces anything at all from the inside. By the mid-1990s, neuroscience had tools no previous generation could have imagined. Brain scanning, real-time imaging, millisecond accurate recordings of neural activity. And yet the hard problem remained exactly where Chalmers had placed it. The scans could show which parts of the brain were active. They could not show what it was like to be the person inside the scanner. When Tononi read Chalmers, something shifted. The hard problem named what he was trying to solve. But Tononi did not believe the answer was purely philosophical. He believed it was mathematical. Consciousness could be integrated information. Experience could be a number. A system was conscious to the degree that its parts were more than the sum, that the whole knew things no individual part could know. He called the measure phi. If phi was high, if the system was deeply integrated more than the sum of its parts, it was conscious. If phi was zero, if the parts could be separated without losing anything, it was not. In 2004, Tononi published the first formal version of integrated information theory. He called it IIT. The theory made a specific and testable prediction. Measure the information integration of any system, and you can tell how conscious it is, not philosophically, mathematically. The reactions were immediate and divided. A small and highly integrated system might have more phis, more consciousness, than a large but modular one. A sleeping brain has lower phi than a waking one. A very simple nervous system might have a tiny amount of experience. And a digital computer, no matter how large, no matter how powerful, might have a phi of nearly zero, because its architecture is fundamentally modular. The transistors do not talk to each other across the whole. They process in parallel, separately, without integration. It can beat the world champion at chess. It can predict the weather. It can answer almost any question, and if IIT is right, there is nobody home. Tononi was careful about what he claimed. He said a thermostat had the smallest possible amount of phi. Not 0.4, but almost nothing. There was something it was like to be a thermostat. A barely there flicker. Nothing human, but not nothing. And there was something it was like to be you. Something irreducible. Something that could not be separated into parts without losing what it was. That gap between the thermostat and you was the entire territory of consciousness, and phi was its map. The theory was elegant. It was precise. It was the first time consciousness had a formal mathematical framework, and it said something uncomfortable. Consciousness was not binary. It came in degrees, and it was everywhere, to some extent. Within a few years, the theory had escaped the neuroscience literature and entered philosophy, cognitive science, and AI research, anywhere the question of mind could follow it. By the mid-2000s, Tononi's theory was one of the most debated frameworks in consciousness science, celebrated by some, attacked by others. It had done something no theory before it had managed. It had made consciousness a serious scientific object, not just a word, a quantity, a thing you could in principle measure. The question was no longer whether consciousness could be studied. The question was whether this formula was the right way to study it. The attacks came from multiple directions. Neuroscientists said phi was untestable with current technology. You could not measure the integrated information of a human brain. The mathematics scaled impossibly. A theory with no experiment was, by definition, not science. Philosophers said the theory proved too much. If simple integration created experience, then the electrical grid, which integrates the energy of millions of households across a continent, might have enormous phi, might be conscious on a vast scale. Was that really what the theory predicted? Tononi's answer, yes, in principle. The grid might have some phi. But its architecture was not designed for integration. Much of its apparent connection was illusory. The phi would be very low. By the 2010s, researchers were attempting to build experiments. They developed a device called the TMS EEG, which could send a pulse to the brain and measure how far the ripple spread. More integration, higher phi, less, lower phi. The early results were promising. Awake brains showed wider ripple patterns than anesthetized ones. conscious patients showed different signatures than vegetative ones. For the first time, there was a physical signature that correlated with the presence or absence of reported experience. This was not proof, but it was evidence. And then, a new pressure arrived. As artificial neural networks became large enough to do things no one expected, to generate language, to reason, to produce convincing answers to novel questions, a different group started reading the consciousness literature. The AI researchers asked, if IIT was right, did that mean these systems, which seemed to understand language, to reason across domains, were not conscious? Or did it mean IIT was wrong? The conversation between neuroscience and AI about consciousness was no longer theoretical. It had stakes. In 2023, the largest pre-registered scientific study on consciousness theories was attempted. An adversarial collaboration, teams supporting IIT, and a rival theory called global workspace theory were given the same experimental data to test their predictions. The results were inconclusive. Both theories survived. Neither was confirmed. The data distinguished between them, but not decisively, which meant the doctor standing in that hospital room had no answer, no formula, no measurement they could trust absolutely. The care continued, it had to. The science was not finished. In hospitals around the world, there are thousands of patients in states between consciousness and unconsciousness, vegetative, minimally conscious, in locked-in states. The question of whether anyone is home is not philosophical for the families of those patients. Decisions about treatment, about pain management, about continued care, are made under that uncertainty every day. We treat patients as if consciousness is present. We have no way to confirm it. The same uncertainty extends beyond human medicine. If consciousness exists on a spectrum, if even simple organisms have some experience, then every decision about animal welfare is a moral decision under ignorance. And the question now includes the systems we are building. The systems we are building can now hold a conversation indistinguishable from human conversation in many contexts. They reason, they adapt, they produce outputs no one predicted. The question of whether there is something it is like to be them is no longer absurd. It is urgent, because if we build systems that can suffer and we do not know they can suffer, we have already made a moral error we cannot take back. Tononi's theory has not answered the hard problem. No theory has. But it has done something. It has made the question measurable. In principle, it has given researchers a target. The question is not comfortable. It does not resolve. It stays open in laboratories, in hospitals, in the decisions we make about the systems we build and the patients we tend. What does it mean to be certain when the most important question remains open? Across the city, across the world, inside bodies that cannot tell you, the question waits for an answer science does not yet have. There is always a moment before we knew. Nothing has changed in the image. Everything has changed in what we know about what we do not know. Tononi has spent 30 years on this question. The theory has evolved. IT has gone through multiple versions, each more precise, each generating new debate. He has been criticized. He has been called a philosopher by neuroscientists and a neuroscientist by philosophers. He has revised his claims. He has not abandoned the question. He said something once that stayed in the field long after the technical debates had moved on. He said, "The goal is not to prove we are conscious, we know we are. The goal is to understand why." That sentence contains the whole of the problem. We know something exists, we do not know what it is. Aristotle looked at the sky and was certain. Semmelweis's colleagues washed their hands in blood and were certain. Fleming's discovery sat on a shelf for 10 years, and the field was certain it didn't matter. Certainty is not the same as truth, and the most important question has always been the one we were most certain we couldn't answer. The question is still open, right now, in this moment, in every hospital room where a patient cannot speak, in every laboratory where a researcher stares at a scan, in every conversation with a system no one fully understands. You are conscious right now, you have been your entire life. and you still don't know exactly what that is. Neither does anyone else. There is always a moment. Before we knew. This is before we knew.